this is a story about John Ross Brown, and not widely known in the mining industry. Um, the description here, a man of simplicity, sincerity, and goodness, was spoken by the pastor at the Oakland Presbyterian Church at his funeral. John Ross Brown's story starts in Dublin in 1832. The British government at the time had just passed, under the Duke of Wellington, of Waterloo fame, had passed an act which was quite controversial called the Catholic Emancipation Act, in the face of very strong internal opposition within the United Kingdom. And as part of the deal, they had disenfranchised about a third of the electorate, raising the standard for voting from 40 shillings up to 200 shillings, which you had to have property of that value or you could not vote. There was a Methodist journalist in Dublin by the name of Thomas Edgerton Brown. And the tithes were a particular hated tax that were primarily borne by the dissenting religions in the United Kingdom. It supported the established Anglican churches, but the way the tax was applied was it was kind of a value-added tax. It wasn't applied on land. It was applied on the value of what you got off the land. So if you had a business or if you were producing crops off the land, you were a tenant farmer, you paid it, but the landowner did not pay it. And as such, it was borne primarily by dissenting religions, by the Quakers, by the Methodists, by the Congregationalists, or in this case also the Catholics. Tenant farmers. But it was particularly hated. And this journalist, Thomas Egerton Brown, published a verse satire called the Parson's Horn Book. And the government at the time was not amused, and it prosecuted Brown and convicted him of libel and sentenced him to a year in jail. But being a warm-hearted government, they said, okay, if you leave the United Kingdom, the sentence will be suspended. So Brown took his family to Louisville, Kentucky, including a 12-year-old John Ross. And John Ross grew up in the 1830s in Louisville. His parents ran a girls' academy, and he was homeschooled and picked up a lot of the skills, among them shorthand, which made him a fairly skilled reporter. And he was also fascinated by the new steamboat business on the Mississippi River. And he took and signed on as a deckhand on a boat between Louisville and New Orleans for about a year in 1838. By 1841, he had worked for newspapers in both Louisville and then in Washington, D.C., and was actually for about a year a reporter for the Congressional Record. In 1842, he signed up as a deckhand on a whaler out of New Bedford, Massachusetts, on a trip that went all the way to the Indian Ocean. And by 1844, he was back in Washington. He married the love of his life, Lucy Mitchell, and he was hired by R.J. Walker as a special assistant to the Treasury Secretary. He started publishing pretty well right away, and in 1846, his book, The Etchings of a Whaling Cruise, was published. And the book was notable in that it had a strong influence on Herman Melville's Moby Dick. But John Ross did not really make any money off that publication. In 1849, he ventured west, partly on the behalf of the Treasury Secretary, but partially on his own account. He made friends with a gentleman by the name of William Gwynn, who was a businessman from Mississippi, was a power in the new California politics. And he was appointed the secretary and recorder for the State Constitutional Convention in Monterey in 1850. And he wrote the minutes of the state constitution, which eventually became part of obviously the whole state. But he got paid very well for that, $10,000, and was able to take his family on a cruise to Europe and the Middle East. And upon returning, began to publish travel books, as well as publishing stories about the travel for Harper's Monthly. And in the bottom right-hand corner there, those are the four Harper brothers who published Harper's Monthly. And he also had the ability to sketch. And he spent the rest of the 1850s in California doing a variety of projects for the Treasury Secretary, as well as going out into the wilds and sketching. And this is a self-portrait of his sketching that appeared in Harper's Monthly. There were a whole series of things that were going on in California at the time. The U.S. Mint, San Francisco Customs, and all kinds of contracting things going on. And they were all plagued with patronage and corruption. There were serious abuses in the San Francisco docks in the importation of both Chinese indentured workers, which wasn't supposed to be happening, but also quite a few women were being brought in and trafficked in servitude. And he, to his credit, tried to stop that to no avail. There were also Indian reservations being set up in California and contracts to supply them. And they were also plagued by fraud. And he did his best to correct some of that. But really, he developed a very sharp eye for detail and continued to publish stories and books on travels in the US and abroad. And he became especially interested in the gold mining areas and the natural beauty of the region. And he became the first great chronicler of the early years of the Comstock mining era. This is one of his more famous portraits. It is a description, the climate of Virginia City. And for those of you who have never been to Virginia City, it's located kind of out in the middle of the desert in Nevada, but higher up at elevation, almost at about 8,000 feet. And it is subjected, he described the weather there as a mixture of hurricanes and snowstorms. And one of his other better turns of phrase was, he was asked to describe the water on the Comstock, and he described it as a taste of arsenic with hints of plumbago and copperas. He went down into the mines and actually sketched things in the mines. And although in the later years, the Comstock was famous for its high-speed hoists and systems, in the early years, the technology and the procedures they used were very conventional for the age, for the early 1860s on the Comstock. At the time, they didn't have enough water up at elevation in Virginia City to process the ore. So it all had to be hauled down into the Carson Valley using oxen teams and mule teams. And everything that came into the Comstock had to be brought in as well by teams from, generally speaking, from California over the Sierra Nevadas on toll roads. And this was an early description of C Street in Virginia City. and then the office and dwelling of the Gould and Curry Company. That's a building that is still in existence, although today it's called the Mackay Mansion because Mackay did eventually occupy it as an office. While in Virginia City, he made very good friends with a man by the name of Sam Clemens, who is also known, of course, as the novelist Mark Twain. Clemens came to Nevada in 1862 after his brother Orion had been appointed secretary to the territorial governor after Nevada was declared a territory separate from Utah in 1862. Sam was a Democrat. His brother Orion was a staunch Republican. But Orion got him a job as a recorder for the territorial legislature. And later, he became the official reporter for the Nevada Constitutional Convention. So in some ways, Clemens' early career kind of followed the track that Ross Brown's did. And Brown met him when he worked for the Territorial Enterprise, which was the major newspaper in Virginia City during the boom years. And the editor of the Territorial Enterprise was a notorious character by the name of Don Goodman. And he was quoted as saying to his newspaper men, "Get your facts straight and then twist them any way you want." But in Clemens' case, he never really bothered much with the facts, which of course made him the great storyteller he was. But Clemens left the Comstock, I believe, in about 1864. And he went to San Francisco briefly, and then he got an assignment actually from Harper's Weekly to go to what were then called the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii, and write a series of stories, which he did. And when he came back in about 1867, Brown actually set up his first lecture, and Clemens actually made most of his money in his earlier years from lecture tours. He was a very funny and capable stand-up comedian. And but we also know today that some of the great 19th century writers, people like Dickens and Sam Clemens, borrowed liberally from a lot of other people of contemporaries. And Brown was known to grumble in later years that Clemens was gaining great fame for a prodigious body of work, some of it mine. So after the Civil War ended in 1865, the US during the Civil War had gone off the gold standard and issued paper money, which was known as the greenback. And at one point in 1863, during some of the not better times in the Civil War, the value of the greenback versus the dollar dropped to about 35 cents. It came back up to about 70 cents after the war and was there at that point. But the US wanted to go back on the gold standard, which meant that if you had a greenback and you wanted to exchange it out for an ounce of gold, you were entitled to, I think it was 1/16 of an ounce of gold. In the Western United States, the greenback was never accepted, or if it would be accepted by anybody, it was accepted at its value against gold. Everybody expected in the Western United States to be paid in gold. Even the Chinese workers who worked on the Union Pacific or the Central Pacific Railway insisted on being paid in gold. But the industry itself was not doing that well as production of gold was falling in California. there were some radical congressmen in the East who wanted the army to go west and take over what were technically illegal Western mines. But the predominant thing was people wanted to go back on the gold standard and make the greenback really as strong a currency, say, as the British pound was at the time. So the Treasury Secretary Hugh McCulloch, who big supporter of the gold standard, got $10,000 appropriated by Congress for a study of the mining industry in the West. What they really wanted to find was the industry stable, or was it going to collapse? What was going to happen? Because if you're going to go back on the gold standard, if you didn't have enough production of gold internally, it would be a disaster. And Brown was Johnny on the spot. He was in Washington in 1867, lobbying against an excise tax on wine for the fledgling California wine industry, of all things. And because he was there, and he knew the California Senator McConnell, he knew Nevada Senator Stewart, and because of that, he got appointed as the person to write the report. So Brown came back to California, and within 4 months, he sent the first draft of his California and Nevada report to McCulloch. And it was published almost right away. But the selection and the report itself was bitterly criticized by Rossiter Raymond, who was then with the fledgling Engineering Journal. He claimed Brown was not technically qualified to do this work. And quoting him, he said, "It could not be worse. The most important part of the work has been put into incompetent hands. Mr. Brown himself is a rapid traveler and a superficial observer. He is the first instance we can recall of a funny man raised to lead the head of a great scientific work." Brown was sensitive to that, and he modestly wrote that, "Although I do not claim to possess a scientific knowledge of mining or of the geological peculiarities of these mineral districts, I have so much practical experience in the examination of mines that I do not feel altogether incompetent to form a correct judgment on the subject." He went back to Congress and asked for some more money to cover expenses so that he could travel to Montana and Idaho and other places in the West. And Congress said, "No, you're not getting it." So Brown, on his own money, basically went and pursued and acquired reports on all the states and territories using contractors, friendships, his own money, and public officials and public reports. And he partially financed a 3-month trip by a mining engineer by the name of J.R. Blatchley into Idaho and Montana in the summer of 1867. Finished the report, and it was issued on March the 5th, 1868. The first report by on the mineral resources in the states and territories west of the Rocky Mountains. 565 pages. It covered not just California and Nevada, but Montana, Idaho, Oregon, Washington, Arizona, and the newly acquired Alaskan territory. It covered the mine production, the costs, the employment, the geology, the processes, and the state of the industry. It covered primarily gold and silver, but it also covered coal and other minerals. And because William Stewart, the senator from Nevada, who was a prime supporter, obviously, of Brown, he advocated in the report, and this was the only place where he advocated for anything, really, for a national school of mines. That had been one of Stewart's favorite things to push for. Reported in 1866, gold production had been greater than $75 million. And one of the things he did, which was wonderful, he really gave great credit to all the people who worked with him and that he used his co-contractors. And he said, if there be any merit to my work, it belongs chiefly to my co-laborers. And included were people like Henry de Groot, a writer and cartographer and a reporter on mining in the Western States, John S. Hittell, a former miner, and he's pictured right here. He was the editor of the Alta California, which at the time would have been the big newspaper in San Francisco, for 25 years. And he had written, or he did eventually write 3 books on Western mining. Myron Angel, the historian and journalist, the mining engineer Blatchley, and another mining engineer by the name of Cesar Lockhart, who wrote a lot of the technical information on the Comstock. There were some judgments and speculations in there. And this little nugget at Butte City, that's in Montana, that territory at the time, some copper mines have been discovered and a furnace erected for smelting. It was not successful. It contains gold and silver, and with a well-regulated furnace, there would be no difficulty smelting it. How's that for a forecast? Written in 1867. And as to the overall supply, he said no uneasiness needs to be felt as to decrease in the source of supply. After many years of travel, I feel justified in asserting that our mineral resources are practically without limit. And the reception was really hugely positive. With the Treasury Secretary McCulloch, the House Speaker Schuyler Colfax, and Nevada Senator Stewart. Schuyler Colfax of the color up on top. He was later became vice president, and of course Stewart, and even Rossiter Raymond, who himself wanted to be the person to write the report, had to say some positive things in light of the political sentiment. Because of the success of the report, Ross Brown was named a U.S. envoy to the Chinese Empire in 1868. And then Rossiter Raymond was appointed commissioner to write the annual report in subsequent years. There were some critical voices, and these 2 characters, Kavanaugh and Holbrook, who were the territorial representatives of the Congress, thought the estimates of gold production in their territories to be way too low. But they had some skin in the game. They were both lawyers, and they were mainly interested in promoting Eastern and foreign mining investments in the West. Now, William Tecumseh Sherman is the man who was supposed to have said, you know, the only good Indian is a dead one. But Kavanaugh was the guy who actually said it. He said, I've never met in my life a good Indian, except when I have seen a dead Indian. And he said it in a congressional speech. And Holbrook was later censured by Congress for unparliamentary language and was killed in a gunfight with a fellow Democrat in Boise a couple of years later. And the DA didn't even try to get an indictment for the person who killed him. Rossiter Raymond was then appointed. He went directly west in his first report and used his own experiences and observations. And by the way, in his very first report, the 1869 one, he was generally very negative on both companies and operations on the Comstock. He specifically said, judging from present appearances only, and regardless of new developments, I should say that remunerative operations on the Comstock can only continue for a period of 18 months. And of course, the boom years in the Comstock were from 1872 to 1877. But all subsequent reports on the Comstock that in the years that Rossiter was the commissioner were actually provided by Lockhart, the German-born San Francisco-based mining engineer who had originally been hired by Ross Brown. So I'm sorry here. The the next few years of Ross Brown's life, he got into financial trouble. Um, he in the West, like I said, nobody would accept greenbacks as payment, but all of his payments from the government were in greenbacks, but he was paying out in gold. So he wasn't the greatest businessman in the world in that regard. And then his second big mistake was when he accepted the position as ambassador to China. He he was immediately in trouble because the man who preceded him was a guy called Anson Burlingame. And one of the things that Anson Burlingame did was he negotiated a rather famous treaty with China called the Burlingame Treaty in 1868. But then he came back to Washington and became the Chinese ambassador in Washington. And he criticized everything that Ross Brown did. When Ross Brown went to China, he had to pay for everything out of his own pocket. And when he came back and he submitted a bill a year later, Congress said, "Oh, we thought you were wealthy enough that you could handle this yourself." And they paid him about half of what he asked for. So he ended up losing very substantial amounts of money. One of the things that Ross Brown was, he was a great defender of indigenous people's rights, and he was also a great defender of the Chinese immigrant rights in the United States. He felt that they were entitled to the same treatment as everybody else. But in the West at the time, there was a tremendous negative feeling, a lot of it led by Irish miners, against the Chinese. And there were votes in California, I think, in 1870, and they were in Nevada in 1880, as to whether Chinese exclusion, this process by which they would forbid Chinese workers from entering the United States who weren't businessmen, in other words, laborers, common laborers. And the votes were like 99.4% and 99.7% for that. So these were extremely unpopular positions for the time. The net effect was for Ross Brown was, even though he continued to write and publish, he was unable to catch up. And he died in fairly serious death in 1875. And is probably less well known than Rossiter Raymond, certainly, who had a wonderful career and a long career, and certainly Mark Twain. He is certainly less well known, but he is the great chronicler of the early years of the Comstock, and he was the person who published the first, which is still, by the way, put out by the Bureau of the Interior, the U.S. Geological Survey, still puts out an annual report on U.S. mining. But Ross Brown was the person who really started that, and it was the success of Ross Brown's report that resulted in that being done on an annual basis. So for that alone, he deserves a fair amount of credit, especially considering his modest background. That's it. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Well, he was a wonderful illustrator, if nothing else. I mean, those are beautiful.
Yes. There are an awful lot of his stuff is really amazing. I just obviously touched on a few of the key ones that people would recognize and have some appreciation for. But his modesty and his shall we say ability to interact with other people, utilize friendships, both to his advantage and disadvantage, are I think he's a very warm. I mean, the description of us as a man of goodness, sincerity, and simplicity that whole genre, if you want to call it that, it would have been unusual for the time.
Mr. McCarthy was illuminating contributions to indigenous as well as Chinese working. I mean, was this pre-DEI or was this some sort of a moral or ethically driven scenario? Maybe that should be touched on so that we're not overwhelmingly influenced as we are in our industry, or that being said, in the mining side of the equation. Something to consider if you're going to publish something on it.
If you're into that type of thing, I've done a fair amount of research, but I wouldn't consider myself an expert on the exploitation of the Chinese, especially as regards the importation of of indentured workers, and a little bit less so on the importation of the women, because about 95% of all the Chinese who came to the US in that period were men. Even if Chinese were married, they didn't bring their wives. But an awful lot of women were trafficked, both as prostitutes or as quote unquote second wives or concubines for the wealthier Chinese who were in the United States. But the industry that was using the Chinese initially was the agricultural industry in California. They were tremendous abusers of indigenous people. They would kidnap and essentially enslave indigenous people in the early years in the California agricultural industry, and it continued then with Chinese when they ran out of indigenous people to do it, and of course. Ross Brown, as an investigator for the Treasury, had the ability to stop the importation of the individual, or at least he tried to. But, there was too much money involved. He wasn't able to overcome that.
It's hard to be combative against that side, especially if your paycheck depends on it, indeed. But he was an early, as you illustrated, early opportunity. Good. Okay. Thank you for that.
May I ask, he had a prominent son, I believe. Was Ross C. Brown his son? And I don't know whether you followed that, but I wonder whether his son's career is part of J. Ross Brown's legacy.
Okay, the answer to that question, his children, to my knowledge, there was one of them I understand associated with the University of California in Berkeley, and and all of his papers are in the Bancroft Library, or at least the family gave them to the Bancroft Library in later years, but. I don't feel competent to answer that question. I know a little bit about it, but I don't feel competent to answer that question. I'll find out, but I'm not. I don't know quite honest with you.
Well, perhaps for the article then.
Perhaps, yeah. There are always other questions. Yes, loose ends.
The other thing is, if you're concerned about scholarship, I mean, we do photo essays as well. The journal is, we're in the format we're in because we like pictures. So, I mean, something as a little lighter in terms of his illustrations or those kinds of things, we'd be happy to have that as well. So, I mean, don't feel that you have to write a book or anything, or, there's going to be another 5 years in the research mines or something like that. I mean, there's all kinds of levels that you could approach this at if you wished. All I'm saying is that it seems an intriguing subject and an intriguing individual, and it would certainly enrich the journal, I think, to have something.
Okay, I will take it on to the degree that I can, and I will ask for help. And if anybody else feels that they want to share the burden and work with me, I will be happy to take that help as well, because I confess that I'm more of a storyteller than I am a scholar, shall we say.
Well, Mr. McCarthy, your unraveling of Sam Clemens was interesting very much on that note. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you, Eamon, for actually, that guy is very fascinating. Never heard of him, and I'll have to keep my eyes open for any other references to him, but very interesting. Thank you very much.
Best to all.
Okay. Thank you all, and see you next month.